50. Half a century of living, of giving, of holding together the loose threads of a family that never seemed to see the stitches. I thought this night would be different. I thought my 50th birthday would be a celebration of me, not just as a wife, not just as a mother, but as a woman who had survived the storms and still stood tall. The hall was dressed for joy. Strings of lights twinkled across the ceiling like captured fireflies. Round tables draped in white linen sparkled with crystal glasses and polished silverware. A small band in the corner was coaxing out smooth jazz, the kind you only half listen to but feel anyway, deep in your bones. The air smelled of roasted chicken, buttered rolls, and the faint sweetness of the cake that I had insisted be strawberry, because I deserved at least that much. I scanned the room, drinking it in. My friends from work, my sisters, neighbors who had known me since I was a newlywed, all of them gathered, talking, laughing, lifting their glasses. My children sat at the front table, their faces glowing in the golden light. For once, I allowed myself to believe I had done something right. And then there was him, my husband, my partner of nearly 3 decades. He looked sharp in his navy suit, his hair combed just enough to look deliberate, not stiff. People always said he had charm. He could walk into a room and own it without lifting a finger, and he loved that attention more than anything, more than me, sometimes, maybe always. Still, I thought, this was my night. I wanted to believe he would play his part, smile, say a few kind words, and let me bask in the glow of turning 50. He stood, glass raised high. The band quieted, conversation stilled. It was his moment, and therefore mine. My heart thudded against my ribs as I braced myself for the usual words. To my wife, my rock, my partner in crime. Instead, he smiled a thin, cruel smile and said, "To my wife, who ruined my life." The words cracked through the hall like thunder. I felt every head turned toward me, eyes wide, glasses suspended in midair. Somewhere, a fork clattered onto a plate. The band faltered and went silent. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My face was hot, but the rest of me had gone cold, as if my blood had frozen in my veins. I laughed, a small broken sound that I prayed would transform this nightmare into a joke. Maybe people would chuckle. Maybe they'd assume he was teasing. But the laugh died in my throat when I saw his expression. He wasn't joking. He looked proud. Triumphant, even. My children shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between us. Friends glanced at one another, uncertain whether to smile or frown. And I sat there, a glass trembling in my hand, trying not to let the humiliation bleed out of me. Inside, my mind was a storm. What did he just say? Why now? Why here? 30 years of memories flashed in an instant. The nights I stayed up waiting for him, the dinners cooked alone, the way he rolled his eyes when I tried to tell him about my day, little cuts, I realized, that had been carving me down slowly. And now this, one final slash in front of everyone I knew. I forced my lips into something resembling a smile. I raised my glass and touched it lightly against his, the way a good wife should, though the sound rang hollow to my ears. The sip of champagne burned all the way down, bitter and sharp. And then, just as I thought the silence couldn't thicken anymore, a voice rang out from the back of the hall. And mine too! It wasn't laughter. It wasn't playful. It was a confession, raw and cutting. The room gasped as one. I turned, my stomach dropping, but the crowd was too thick to see who had spoken, just shadows at the edge of the light. My husband's smirk widened, like he had orchestrated this whole scene, like he was relishing the spectacle of my shame. I sat frozen, my skin prickling under the fluorescent lights, every eye pinned on me as though I were a bug on a board. I wanted to vanish into the floor, but instead I sat taller, forcing my spine straight, swallowing the lump in my throat. That was the night my life as I knew it ended. Not with candles blown out, not with a wish whispered over frosting, but with a toast that cut me open in front of everyone I loved. when that voice cut through the silence, and mine too. It felt like the air in the room collapsed. A second blow, swift and merciless. My chest tightened as if an invisible hand had clenched around my heart. I twisted in my chair, trying to find the source, but all I saw were startled faces, half hidden in shadow, some turning toward the back, some already craning their necks to catch my reaction. It could have been a man or a woman. The tone was sharp, pained, mocking. I couldn't tell. What I did know was that the voice carried familiarity, like someone who had waited a long time to let those words out. Not random, not casual, but purposeful. I gripped the stem of my glass so tightly I thought it might snap in my hand. The people at the nearest tables were whispering now, their words buzzing like bees in my ears. What does that mean? Who said that? Is this real? I wanted to shout at them, to demand silence, but instead I sat there with my face frozen into a polite mask that was cracking with every passing second. My husband lowered his glass and chuckled, low and smug. He didn't search the crowd for the voice. He didn't act surprised or insulted. No, he just smirked, as though this had all been scripted, a performance where I was the unwitting fool. Heat spread through my chest, a slow burn of anger and humiliation. I could feel my cheeks flush, though the rest of my body trembled cold. For a split second, I thought about standing up, about telling everyone to go home, about reclaiming the moment. But the weight of their stares pinned me in place. I glanced toward my children again. My daughter's face was pale, her eyes darting nervously toward her father. My son sat stiffly, his jaw tight, fists clenched in his lap. They were old enough to understand something was terribly wrong, but too stunned to intervene. And I was their mother, supposed to be the steady one. What example would it set if I broke down here, now, in front of them all? So I swallowed the scream clawing at my throat. I pressed my lips into a faint smile, as if all of this were some elaborate inside joke only we were in on. But my hands betrayed me. Shaking so violently, I had to set the glass down before I dropped it. The band, bless them, tried to resume playing, but the music came out hesitant, scattered, like even they were unsure if it was appropriate. The sound only made the humiliation worse, like a laugh track behind a tragedy. The night blurred after that. Guests began excusing themselves sooner than they should have, murmuring half-hearted congratulations as they slipped out the door. Some hugged me stiffly, their eyes full of pity I couldn't bear. Others avoided me altogether, unable to meet my gaze, and still I sat there smiling, nodding, pretending, while inside a storm was tearing me apart. When the cake was finally brought out, its pink frosting glowing under the candles, no one sang. Not really. A few voices mumbled, half-hearted, and the rest hung back. I leaned forward, blew out the flames in silence, and wished for nothing but strength. Strength not to collapse right there on the tablecloth. As people filed out, I heard bits of conversation float back to me. Did you hear what he said? What do you think she did to him? Who was that other voice? Gossip had already grown roots in the room. By tomorrow morning, the story would be halfway across town, twisted into a dozen different versions. When the last guest left, I began gathering plates and glasses with mechanical precision, like it was just another party, just another night. My husband was at the bar, pouring himself a second whiskey, humming under his breath, unconcerned. He looked up once, caught my eye, and gave me a mocking little toast as if to say, "Your move." And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I had always been the woman who absorbed the hurt, who let it settle into her bones and called it survival. But not tonight, not after this. His words were cruel, but the stranger's voice, that second accusation, was something else. It was a thread dangling in the air, waiting for me to pull. Whoever had shouted had done more than embarrass me. They had opened a door, and behind it was a truth I hadn't yet seen. I stacked another plate, wiped the frosting from the tablecloth, and smiled grimly to myself. If he thought he had humiliated me beyond repair, he didn't know me as well as he thought. The night wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The house was quiet that night after the party, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that hums, too loud, like static in the walls, like silence with teeth. I moved through the rooms in my party dress, still smelling faintly of perfume and frosting, my heels clicking against the hardwood. My husband had gone to bed without a word, his shoes abandoned near the couch, his half-empty glass of whiskey sweating on the table. I should have been exhausted. My body ached from smiling, from standing, from keeping my spine straight under the weight of so many stares. But sleep didn't even cross my mind. Instead, I sat at the edge of the bed, still dressed, staring at the man who had once been my world. He was already snoring softly, as though nothing had happened, as though his words hadn't detonated in that hall. And that was when it struck me, maybe for the first time, that this wasn't new. This cruelty, this casual disregard, it had been there all along, trickling out in little comments, little moments I had brushed off because I wanted the marriage to work, because I thought endurance was the same thing as love. I thought back to the first time I noticed it years ago at a neighborhood barbecue. He had wrapped his arm around me in front of the men from his office and said with a laugh, "She was so ambitious once. Now she just runs after the kids and burns the casserole." Everyone laughed, including me, though I remember the sting blooming hot in my chest. I told myself it was a joke. That's what men do, I reasoned. They tease. But it never stopped. The jokes got sharper, quieter, more precise. About my weight after the children, about the bakery job I once dreamed of growing into something bigger, about how I always worried too much. Every barb landed and I just absorbed them, one after another like stones in my pockets. I remembered the first years, when we were young and broke and it felt like us against the world. He used to bring me coffee when I was cramming for nursing exams, scribble little notes on napkins, sing off-key in the car. That man was real once, I think, but somewhere along the line he vanished, replaced by this version of him, sharp edges, wandering eyes, a smirk that never reached me. My friends used to ask me how we lasted so long. I would smile and say, "Because I'm patient." But now, staring at his sleeping face, I wondered if patience had just been another word for silence, for burying the things I didn't want to admit. The party had ripped the curtain down. His words weren't some drunken slip. They were a revelation, a truth he'd been living in and I'd been pretending not to see. And then that other voice, "And mine too," echoed in my head like a warning. Who else had he hurt? What secrets was he keeping behind that smug grin? I wandered into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, though my hands shook so badly I spilled some on the counter. I leaned on the sink, staring out the window at the dark street. Across the way, the Petersons' house glowed warm and yellow, their curtains drawn, their laughter faintly carrying across the quiet. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of marriage I thought I'd built, or at least convinced myself I had. The humiliation from the party replayed in loops. My friends' startled glances, my children's tight jaws, the whispers curling around me like smoke. I could feel it spreading already, a story that would outgrow me, become something bigger than the truth. And in the middle of it all, me, the woman who ruined his life according to him. But underneath the shame, something else had begun to stir. Not rage, not yet. More like a raw awareness, the sudden clarity of someone waking from a long sleep. Maybe I had ruined his life. Maybe I had ruined the fantasy he wanted. The submissive wife, the woman who never questioned, who kept the house spotless and her mouth shut. If that was the life he mourned, then yes, I had ruined it. And maybe that wasn't a failure. Maybe that was survival. Still, the ache cut deep. 3 decades together, children, a shared mortgage, Christmas mornings and 4th of July cookouts, and in the end, what did I have? A husband who toasted my humiliation like it was champagne, A stranger in the back of the hall who claimed their life had been ruined too. I wiped the counter dry, turned off the kitchen light, and stood in the darkness. I didn't have answers yet, only questions. But questions were enough. Questions meant cracks in the foundation. Questions meant maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the fool he thought I was. And for the first time in years, I let myself whisper into the quiet. Not for him, not for anyone else, but for me. Something's going on. And I'm going to find out. By the time the last guest left, the hall looked like a battlefield. Crumpled napkins lay scattered like surrender flags, half-empty wine glasses glimmered in the low light, and the once proud buffet table sagged with cold leftovers no one touched after the toast. My feet throbbed in my shoes, but I didn't sit down. I couldn't. I was afraid if I stopped moving, the tears would finally come, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. He lingered near the bar, swirling a glass of whiskey, humming a tune under his breath. No shame in his face, no apology, just the lazy arrogance of a man who thought he'd won something. Occasionally, he'd glance over at me with that infuriating half-smile, as if to say, "You'll get over it. You always do." I collected plates, stacked chairs, wiped spills, tasks that should have fallen to the staff but somehow landed in my hands, because habit is hard to break. All my life I'd cleaned up after people, after my children, after my friends, after him. Tonight the ritual felt different. Every glass I lifted was heavier, every napkin dirtier, every stain a reminder of what he'd done. As I scraped frosting off the tablecloth, I thought of my guests' faces as they filed out. Some hugged me stiffly, whispering, "Stay," strong, as if I'd just buried a relative. Others avoided my eyes altogether, too uncomfortable to confront the scene they'd just witnessed. And then there were those who looked at me with thinly veiled curiosity, eager to carry my humiliation home like gossip in a gift bag. The echo of that stranger's voice haunted me still. And mine, too. It had cracked the room open wider than his words alone. Whoever it was, they had tethered their pain to mine, made me part of a story bigger than myself. I should have been curious. I should have asked questions, demanded answers. Instead, I had been frozen in place, a prop in someone else's performance. My children hovered awkwardly near the doorway, unsure whether to help or retreat. I caught my daughter's eye, wide, wounded, as if she didn't know who to comfort first, me or herself. My son muttered something about heading home, his jaw tight, fists jammed into his pockets. I let them go. They didn't need to see me like this, bent over with a rag in my hand, scrubbing away the evidence of a party that had ended in ashes. At one point, he wandered over and set his empty glass down on the table I had just cleaned. "Don't look so serious," he drawled. "It was a joke." People need to lighten up a joke. That's what he called it. My humiliation, my unraveling, a punchline. I stared at him, but no words came. Not yet. My tongue felt heavy, my chest hollow. If I opened my mouth, I feared nothing but sobs would pour out, and I wasn't ready to give him that victory. So I turned back to the table, wiping furiously at a spot that had already been scrubbed clean. Eventually, the staff returned to help with the heavier cleanup. I slipped outside into the cool night air, clutching my purse like a shield. The parking lot was nearly empty, only a few cars glinting under the streetlights. I leaned against the brick wall of the building, the rough texture grounding me as my breath came in short bursts. I thought of the vows we had made nearly 30 years ago, the promises whispered when the world was young and love seemed indestructible. All those years I had worked to keep the foundation steady, through bills, through illnesses, through nights when I wondered if I mattered at all. And tonight, with one toast, he had knocked it all down. When I finally returned inside, he was gone. Just like that. No word, no explanation, no acknowledgement. His absence left the room colder than his presence ever had. I finished tidying what I could, thanked the staff with a hollow smile, and gathered the leftover cake into a box. My birthday cake. My 50th year marked not by joy, but by shame. Driving home, the silence in the car pressed in on me. The streetlights blurred through the windshield, streaks of gold against the black. I kept replaying his words, the laughter that never came, the voice from the back. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles whitening, as if I could steer myself away from the memory. When I walked into the house, the scent of stale perfume and spilled champagne clung to my skin. I set the cake box on the counter and stared at it, untouched, mocking me with its pink frosting and neat lettering. Happy 50th, Julia. I whispered to myself in the quiet kitchen, the words tasting bitter. Happy birthday. That night, long after the cake sat untouched on the counter and the house had gone still, I found myself flipping through an old photo album, the kind with plastic sleeves and handwritten captions in blue ink, pages curling at the edges. It had been years since I opened it. Maybe I thought staring at the past would help me understand how I ended up here, at 50, carrying humiliation in my chest like a second heartbeat. The first picture was of us in college. Me with my long hair and denim jacket, him with that easy grin that once made me feel like the luckiest girl alive. We were young, broke, and absolutely certain the world belonged to us. He used to bring me coffee during study sessions, scribble little notes in the margins of my textbooks. Back then, his attention felt like sunlight, steady and warm. I flipped the page and saw our wedding photo. My dress wasn't expensive, but I had never felt more beautiful. He stood tall beside me, proud, his hand resting firmly at the small of my back. Our vows were simple, full of promises we believed we could keep, to stand by each other, to lift each other up, to build a life together. I clung to those promises through everything that followed, even when he let them slip like water through his fingers. The early years were hard. We moved across states, chasing jobs, counting pennies to make rent, eating spaghetti 3 nights a week because it was cheap. But I didn't mind. We laughed through the struggles. We made it work. I remember one night when our car broke down in the middle of nowhere, and instead of fighting, we sat on the hood and looked at the stars until a tow truck arrived. It felt like us against the world. Then came the children. Sleepless nights, bottles, scraped knees, school projects that always seemed to fall on my shoulders. He provided, yes, but I carried the weight of the house, the kids, the endless unseen labor that no one claps for. I gave up the nursing program I once dreamed of finishing because someone had to stay home. He told me it was the right choice, that my time would come later. Later never arrived. I started a small bakery job on the side once the kids were in school, a dream I tried to nurture into something bigger. I wanted it to be mine, something separate from him, but he always laughed when I talked about expansion. "You're good at cookies, Jules, but let's be realistic," he'd say, patting my hand like I was a child. "Don't get ahead of yourself." Little by little, his charm turned sharp. Compliments grew rare, replaced by jokes at my expense. At barbecues, he'd smirk and tell people, "She was supposed to be a nurse, but she settled for burning bread." People laughed. I laughed too, though my chest burned every time. Those words piled up over the years, small stones I carried silently until they weighed me down. But I stayed. I told myself marriage wasn't supposed to be perfect. That loyalty meant absorbing the cracks, smoothing them over, pretending the foundation was still solid. I told myself our children needed stability more than I needed to be seen. Looking at the album now, the progression was painfully clear. Smiling newlyweds gave way to tired parents. Vacation photos where I was behind the camera while he stood in the center, arms spread, the star of every shot. Family dinners where he sat at the head of the table, glass raised while I hovered near the kitchen, making sure everyone had what they needed. And now, at 50, I was still standing off to the side, still invisible, except when he wanted to make me the punchline. I closed the album and pressed my hand against the cover, as though I could keep the past from spilling out any further. The echoes of our marriage filled the quiet house. His laughter, my silence, the years I'd traded for the hope that things would change. He had given his toast as though I had ruined his life. But looking back, I wondered if it wasn't the other way around. Maybe he had ruined mine, piece by piece. So slowly I hadn't noticed until there was nothing left of the girl in the denim jacket who once believed in forever. I set the album aside, switched off the lamp, and sat in the dark. For the first time in years, I let myself admit the truth. I wasn't just humiliated, I was angry. And anger, I realized, was a dangerous kind of fuel. By morning, the story had already outgrown the walls of the banquet hall. That's the thing about small American towns. News doesn't travel, it sprints. Before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, my phone buzzed with texts and missed calls. Friends, acquaintances, people I hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered my number. Each message wrapped itself in a thin layer of concern, but underneath it, I could feel the hunger. "Hey, Julia, are you okay? I heard something happened at your party." Don't listen to what people are saying. You know how folks exaggerate, "Call me when you can." I want to hear your side, my side, as if truth was a luxury I could package neatly and hand over, as if a single phone call could erase the sound of his voice declaring me the ruin of his life. At the grocery store that afternoon, I felt the stares before I saw them. 2 women by the produce aisle lowered their voices when I walked past, their eyes darting over the lettuce like it had suddenly become fascinating. A man near the dairy section greeted me too brightly, the way people do when they're desperate to cover the fact that they know your secrets. The cashier, a girl barely out of high school, smiled nervously as she scanned my items. "Happy belated birthday," she said, cheeks pink, as though she regretted the words the moment they left her mouth. I forced a smile and thanked her, all the while feeling my skin itch under the invisible weight of whispers. By evening, the phone calls had shifted from friends to relatives. My sister phoned twice, her voice full of fury on my behalf. "Julia, what the hell was he thinking? Saying that in front of everyone?" she snapped. "If I were you, I'd have thrown the cake in his face." I laughed softly because I didn't know how to explain that rage doesn't always come out in fire. Sometimes it sits heavy in your stomach, cold and steady, waiting. Neighbors were less direct. Mrs. Collins from across the street brought over a pie, her eyes soft with pity. "You know, people talk," she said as she set it on my counter, "but don't let it get to you." "You're stronger than that." She meant well, but her words landed like a verdict. People were already talking and they would not stop. Even my workplace wasn't safe. I overheard 2 co-workers whispering near the break room, their voices carrying through the thin walls. "Did you hear what her husband said? Ruined his life. Can you imagine?" "Yeah, but what did she do?" Men don't say things like that out of nowhere. That last line sliced deeper than I expected. What did she do? As though my existence, my years of sacrifice, my quiet endurance had somehow wronged him. As though being the one who held everything together wasn't enough. I drove home that night with my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. Every house I passed looked normal, ordinary. Families eating dinner, dogs barking in backyards, porch lights glowing. Behind each window, I imagined people talking about me, my name in their mouths like a flavor they couldn't quite place. At home, he was already in his recliner watching TV like the world wasn't buzzing with the fallout of his words. He didn't flinch when I walked in, didn't ask how I was holding up. He just gestured toward the screen, some sports highlight playing, and said, "You missed a good one." That was his gift to me after shattering my dignity. Casual indifference. I went upstairs, shut the bedroom door, and sat on the edge of the bed. The house was full of noise. TV downstairs, cars on the street, neighbors laughing on their porches. But inside me, there was nothing but silence. A silence so heavy it felt alive. I realized then that humiliation doesn't end when the party's over. It follows you into every corner of your life, echoed by strangers, whispered by neighbors. cemented by the very people who claim to care. But somewhere inside that silence, something shifted again. Shame is heavy, yes, but it can harden into something else. Something sharper. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. Tired eyes, tight jaw, a woman people thought was broken, and I whispered to her, "They can talk. Let them talk. The truth isn't theirs to decide." For the first time since the party, I felt the faintest spark of power. Small, but enough. The night after the party, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his snoring. It used to comfort me, that sound. Proof of another body in the house, of safety, of belonging. Now it grated like sandpaper, each inhale a reminder that he could sleep soundly while I drowned in questions. That voice. And mine too. It wasn't just heckling. It had carried something sharp, personal, like the edge of a knife honed for years. Whoever shouted hadn't done it for attention. They meant it. And if they meant it, then my husband's toast wasn't just cruelty. It was confession. I rolled onto my side and looked at him, his mouth slack, a smear of whiskey still on his breath. How many lies had I mistaken for exhaustion? How many business dinners were really alibis? I thought of the way he smirked after the toast, the way he let the silence sit heavy on me while he basked in it. That wasn't improvisation. That was a man who knew he had a secret too big to stay buried forever. By morning, resolve had replaced the nausea. I brewed coffee, set his mug down the way I always did, buttered his toast out of sheer habit. He didn't notice the tremor in my hand or the way I avoided his eyes. He rattled off a list of errands he'd probably have to run after work, kissed the air near my cheek, and left without asking if I needed anything. The moment the door shut, I felt like the house exhaled. For the first time in years, I let myself move differently. I opened drawers I normally ignored. His desk, his dresser, even the glove compartment of his car parked in the driveway. Most of it was ordinary clutter, receipts, pens, scraps of paper. But one folded sheet in his nightstand stopped me cold. It was a printout of an email. The top had been ripped off like he'd tried to hide the sender's name, but the body of it was there in black and white. "Don't worry. She's too blind to ever notice. We'll get what we want," signed only with the initial L. The words burned into me. Too blind. That's what he thought of me. That's what someone else thought of me too. I tucked the paper back exactly as I found it. My heart hammered, but my mind was sharp. This wasn't paranoia anymore. It was proof, even if incomplete. That afternoon, I returned to the hall where the party had been. The staff were clearing the last of the decorations, scraping wax off the tables, vacuuming confetti from the carpet. I approached the manager, a kind woman who had seen me at my best and now at my worst. "Do you remember who was at the back of the room?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated. "It was crowded, Julia. But..." She looked at me carefully. There was a man. Sitting alone. He didn't eat, barely drank. Left right after that. Outburst a stranger. Or someone I should have recognized, but didn't. Walking back to my car, the winter wind cut through my coat, but I barely felt it. My mind spun faster than my steps. If my husband's cruelty was tied to this man's accusation, then there was a web I hadn't seen before. A web I had been living inside without realizing the threads were tightening around me. That night, I confronted him in the smallest way I could manage. Over dinner, I asked, "Do you know who shouted from the back at the party?" He didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from his plate. "Probably one of your friends," he muttered. "Everyone knows you like to play the martyr." The words landed heavy, but I studied his face instead of reacting. His jaw tightened just a fraction too much. His fork scraped the plate harder than it needed to. A lie. A lazy one, but a lie all the same. I realized then that I had been asking the wrong questions for years. Not why he hurt me, but who else he was hurting. I went to bed early, leaving him in front of the TV, his laughter mingling with the canned laughter from the screen. In the dark, I stared at the ceiling again, but this time with clarity. The voice in the hall had given me a thread, and now, for the first time, I was ready to pull. I woke the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, the kind that comes after a storm when the air is raw and sharp, and you can finally see what's been there all along. For decades, I had been reacting, smoothing over his temper, excusing his jokes, pretending not to notice the late nights and secretive phone calls. But now I understood. My silence had been his greatest weapon. Not anymore. I started small. I opened a notebook I usually kept for grocery lists and wrote the date at the top. Beneath it, I recorded everything I had found so far, the words of his toast, the stranger's voice, the shredded email in his drawer. I wrote down how he had dismissed me at dinner, how he hadn't even looked up from his plate when I asked the simplest of questions. Putting the words on paper made them real. They stared back at me like evidence in a trial. He thought I was blind, but I knew better now. Blind women don't start keeping records. I began watching him with a different eye. His mornings were always rushed, his ties never quite matching his shirts, his briefcase packed with more than just papers. At night, he poured his whiskey with a little too much relief, like the day's performance had finally ended. When his phone buzzed, he tilted it away from me, his thumb swiping with practiced secrecy. Once, when he left the room, I glanced at the screen. The message preview was only 3 words. She suspects nothing. My breath caught. I wanted to grab the phone, scroll until I had names and numbers and undeniable proof. But instinct stopped me. If he knew I was looking, the game would end before it began. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want it to end on his terms. So I played my part. I laughed when he tossed me a careless joke. I kissed his cheek when he left for work. I set his dinner plate in front of him like always, nodding at his half-hearted stories about clients and meetings. But inside, I was storing every detail, every slip, every thread. The gossip around town only added fuel. At the bakery, customers tried to hide their curiosity behind polite smiles. "How was your birthday?" They'd ask, eyes glittering with questions they didn't dare say aloud. I'd smile, hand them their bread, and let them leave wondering if I was broken. But I wasn't. Not anymore. At night, when the house was quiet, I returned to my notebook. I sketched timelines, cross-referenced his supposed business trips with dates of unusual receipts I'd found in his wallet. A steakhouse bill from a city he claimed he hadn't visited in months. A hotel key card tucked between 2 old receipts. Each piece was small, but together they formed a picture I couldn't ignore. I thought of the stranger at the party, his voice slicing through the hall. Whoever he wasn't lying. My husband had wrecked more than just my life. And if I found that man again, maybe I'd find the truth. The anger that had once felt like acid in my chest began to solidify, hard and steady. I wasn't flailing anymore. I was planning. And the planning gave me power. One evening, he caught me staring at him across the table. "What?" he asked, his tone sharp, defensive. "Nothing," I said smoothly, taking another bite of my food. "Just thinking." "About what?" I smiled faintly. "About how things always come to light, one way or another." He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable, and for the first time in years, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not arrogance, not boredom, but worry. It was gone in a second, buried under his usual smirk, but I had seen it, and it was enough to keep me steady. That night, as I brushed my teeth, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For so long, I had avoided looking too closely, afraid of what I'd see. Now I looked straight into my own eyes. They weren't broken. They weren't weak. They were alive with something new. Resolve. I closed my notebook, slid it under the mattress, and turned off the light. Tomorrow, I promised myself, I'd start pulling harder on the threads, and when the whole thing unraveled, he wouldn't even see it coming. It didn't take long for the cracks to widen. I had been documenting, watching, biding my time, but there's only so much venom a person can swallow before it seeps into their bloodstream. One night, over dinner, he brought it up again. Not directly. He never did anything directly. That wasn't his style. He liked the sting of subtlety, the kind that left a bruise no one else could see. "People are still talking about your big birthday bash," he said, slicing into his steak with a smug grin. "Guess you finally got the attention you always wanted." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. For a moment, I saw myself through his eyes, the pitiful wife who'd been humiliated in front of everyone, too meek to fight back. I chewed slowly, set my fork down, and dabbed my lips with the napkin. "You really think it's me they're talking about?" I asked lightly. He glanced up, surprised by the calm in my voice. "Who else would it be?" I tilted my head. "Maybe the man who shouted from the back. Funny how you didn't seem shocked at all, almost like you were expecting it." The smirk faltered, just for a second, but I caught it. He chuckled and leaned back in his chair. "Conspiracy theories now?" "Careful, Jules. You'll sound crazier than they already think you are." Crazy. That was his favorite weapon. Dismiss me, label me, make me doubt myself, but it didn't land the same way it used to. My notebook was tucked upstairs under the mattress, filled with evidence that told me I wasn't crazy at all. I was awake. I smiled faintly, almost pitying him. "You always underestimate me," I said. His eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I answered smoothly, rising to clear the table. "Just an observation." I carried the plates into the kitchen, my pulse steady, my movements deliberate. Behind me, I could feel his stare, sharp and suspicious. For once, he was the one unsettled, and I savored it like a sip of strong coffee. Later that night, he tried to corner me in the living room. The TV was muted, the air thick with the smell of his second glass of whiskey. "You've been acting strange," he said, his tone sharp. "What's going on in that head of yours?" I sank into the couch across from him, folded my hands in my lap. "I've just been thinking about how fragile things are, how one little thread pulled the wrong way and the whole thing can unravel." His grip tightened on his glass. "You're talking nonsense." "Am I?" I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. "You know what I realized the other night? You're not nearly as clever as you think you are." The words landed between us like a lit match. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing into slits. For a moment, I thought he might throw the glass, shout, explode the way he sometimes did when he'd had too much to drink. But instead, he laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "You're bluffing," he said finally. "You always bluff, but you never follow through." I met his gaze, steady and unblinking. "Maybe that's what you want to believe." We sat there in silence, the ticking of the wall clock filling the space. For years, silence had been my prison. Tonight, it was my weapon. I let it stretch, thick and suffocating, until he finally broke it. "Go to bed," he muttered, standing too quickly. "You're talking like a fool." I didn't move. I just watched him climb the stairs, his shoulders stiff, his steps heavier than usual. He knew. Something had shifted, even if he couldn't name it. When the house was quiet again, I opened my notebook and added a new entry. "He's nervous." Good. I sat back in my chair, the pen still warm in my hand. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of his mockery. I wasn't afraid of what he might say next, or even what he might do, because the truth was I wasn't bluffing anymore. The anger that had once been scattered and raw had become something else, focused, dangerous, a flame I could hold steady in the palm of my hand. And as I closed the notebook, I whispered into the silence, "He doesn't know it yet, but the fire's already lit." Once the silence stopped hurting, I realized it could be useful. Silence lets you move unnoticed. It lets you gather, arrange, prepare. And preparation, I discovered, was its own kind of revenge. I started with small things, habits, routines. I learned his schedule better than he did, which mornings he left the house earlier than usual, which nights he lingered at work, but returned smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. When he poured his first whiskey, when he switched to his second. I cataloged it all in my notebook, careful, precise. At the bakery, I pretended everything was normal. I smiled at customers, dusted sugar over fresh pastries, tied ribbons around boxes. All the while, I slipped receipts, notes, little fragments of evidence into a plain manila envelope hidden in the bottom drawer of my desk. Every piece felt like another nail hammered into the coffin of his lies. One afternoon, I followed him. Not closely, not enough for him to notice, just enough to see the truth for myself. He told me he had a late client meeting downtown. Instead, I watched from across the street as he ducked into a hotel with a woman half his age. Her hand brushed his arm as they disappeared inside. I snapped a photo with my phone, my hand steady. No tears this time, just proof. That night, when he came home, he was whistling. He kissed my cheek absently, dropped his keys on the counter, and poured himself a drink. I set his dinner down in front of him, same as always, my face calm. Inside, though, I was already fitting the photo into the timeline, another puzzle piece in the picture I was building. I didn't confront him. Not yet. That would have been too easy for him. He thrived on fights, on turning my words against me until I doubted myself. No. This time I wanted him off balance. I wanted him confused, unsteady, not knowing when the blow would land. So I smiled when he mocked me. I nodded when he lied. I tucked away every scrap of evidence, every strange receipt, every overheard phrase on late-night phone calls he thought I was too asleep to notice. Meanwhile, I started weaving connections. A friend at the county office helped me check property records. Another, more discreet, slipped me copies of his business filings. Patterns emerged. Shell accounts, quiet transfers, signatures that weren't. Mine, but should have been. He wasn't just betraying me in love. He was carving pieces of our life together and handing them to someone else. And through it all, that stranger's voice from my birthday haunted me. And mine, too. Who was he? What piece of my husband's double life had collided with mine? The question gnawed at me. I began asking careful questions around town, feigning casual interest. A man at the barber shop, a woman at the library. Bits and pieces trickled back, debts unpaid, deals soured, a reputation rotting at the edges. My husband wasn't just cruel, he was reckless. And his trail of ruin was longer than I'd realized. The knowledge didn't crush me. It steadied me. Every new discovery was another thread in the rope I was braiding, not to hang myself with, but to bind him. One night, as I tucked the latest receipt into my envelope, I paused and stared at the growing stack. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't tighten. I felt calm, almost eerily so, because I knew now I wasn't helpless. I looked at the clock. 11 p.m. He was downstairs, laughing too loudly at the television, ice clinking in his glass. I whispered into the quiet room, "You don't know it yet, but I'm building your reckoning." It wasn't about rage anymore. Rage is hot and wild and burns out fast. What I had now was colder, steadier. A fire banked low, waiting for the right breath to roar into an inferno. And when it came, it wouldn't just scorch him. It would expose him. The man who humiliated me, who thought I was blind, who believed his secrets were safe. I closed the envelope, slid it back into its hiding place, and turned off the light. For the first time in weeks, I slept easily, my dreams untroubled. Because revenge, I realized, is just another word for control, and I had finally taken mine back. The moment didn't come suddenly. It grew, like a storm rolling in from the horizon, impossible to ignore once you'd felt the first gust of wind. I had been waiting, watching, building my arsenal. And when the right opportunity finally arrived, it felt less like chance and more like inevitability. It started with the community fundraiser, a charity dinner downtown, the kind of event my husband adored. A stage, a microphone, people in press suits ready to applaud his every word. He insisted we go, brushing aside my reluctance. "We need to be seen," he said, buttoning his cufflinks in the mirror. "People expect us there." I smiled at his reflection, said nothing, and slipped my envelope into my purse. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers, tables set with white linens and silver platters. Laughter floated through the air, but underneath it all I felt a current, an electric tension only I seemed to notice. My husband shook hands, clapped backs, flashed that grin that made strangers trust him instantly. I played the dutiful wife at his side, my smile polite, my eyes sharp. When he took the stage to speak, I could almost laugh at the predictability. He leaned on the podium, thanked the sponsors, made a few jokes at his own expense, drawing easy laughter. Then, as always, he reached for me. "And my wife, Julia," he said, his voice warm enough to fool the room. "The woman who keeps me grounded, who makes all this possible." I held his gaze from my table. My lips curved into a faint smile, but my hand was already on the envelope. When the applause quieted, I stood. Chairs scraped the floor as people turned toward me. My heart pounded steady, but my voice was clear. "Since we're talking about gratitude," I said, "I think it's time we all acknowledge what my husband has really been making possible." A murmur spread like ripples in water. He froze at the podium, his smile faltering. "Julia, sit down," he hissed, his voice not quite low enough. But I didn't. I reached into my purse and withdrew the stack of papers, the photos, the receipts, my evidence. I laid them on the nearest table where everyone could see. "This," I said evenly, "is what he's been hiding. Affairs, lies, money siphoned off into accounts I never signed for, hotel rooms that didn't include me, and debts he left rotting in other people's lives." The silence was louder than any applause. Guests leaned forward, eyes darting to the papers, the photos of him with another woman, his signature on documents tied to accounts in names that weren't ours. Someone gasped. Another whispered, "Oh my God!" I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I let the evidence speak. At the podium, his face turned a deep red. "You don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, voice cracking at the edges. She's exaggerating. She's bitter." I raised a hand. "I have copies in safe places. Go ahead, call me bitter. But every word is true, and now everyone knows." The tension snapped like a wire. Whispers swelled into open voices. "That explains the missing funds. He borrowed from me last year." I knew something was off. My husband's composure crumbled. He stepped away from the podium, reaching for me, but I didn't move. He hissed under his breath, "How could you do this?" "How could you?" I answered quietly, though loud enough for those nearest to hear. And that was it. The room had turned. Whatever mask he had worn for years was gone, and all that remained was a man stripped bare in the glare of truth. People didn't linger after that. They avoided his eyes, muttered excuses, left plates half-eaten. By the time the night ended, the only ones left were the organizers, looking at him with thinly veiled disgust, and me standing tall in the same dress he once mocked as too plain. Driving home, he tried to shout, to rage, to reclaim the control he'd lost, but his voice was hollow, bouncing off the windows like a ghost. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the wheel. For years, he had humiliated me in private and finally in public. Tonight, the balance had shifted. Tonight, his lies were no longer secrets whispered in dark corners. They were facts, exposed under chandeliers, impossible to take back. And I knew, as we drove in silence, that this was only the beginning of his unraveling. The days after the fundraiser felt like walking through smoke, thick, choking, impossible to escape. Wherever I went, eyes followed, not with pity anymore, not just with curiosity, but with something sharper. People weren't whispering about me now. They were whispering about him. At the grocery store, the same women who had lowered their voices before now met my eyes and nodded. One even touched my arm gently. "You were brave," she said. "Brave." I wasn't sure that's what it was. It hadn't felt like bravery. It had felt like necessity, like breathing after holding my breath too long. At church on Sunday, the pews around us were half empty. Families who once invited us to barbecues now shifted uncomfortably, offering me sympathetic smiles but pointedly ignoring him. When the service ended, people lined up to hug me. Not him, never him. But the hardest part wasn't the neighbors or the friends. It was the children. My daughter called me first, her voice trembling. "Mom, is it true?" "All of it?" I swallowed hard. "Yes, sweetheart." Every word silence stretched, then a quiet sob. I don't know how to look at him anymore. Neither did I. My son was angrier. "You should have told us sooner," he snapped when he came by the house. "You let him humiliate you for years and just let it happen. Why didn't you say something?" His words cut deep because they weren't entirely wrong. I had let it happen. I had chosen silence over chaos, patience over confrontation, and now he carried some of that weight, too. "I was trying to protect you," I whispered. "Protect me?" He shook his head. "I didn't need protection. I needed the truth he left without hugging me, his anger trailing like smoke behind him. That night, I sat in the kitchen with the lights off, staring at the dark window. My reflection looked older than I remembered, lines etched deep around my mouth, shadows under my eyes. I felt hollow, emptied out. For 30 years, I had built a life around him, raised children, built a home, held everything together while he chipped away at me piece by piece, and now it was gone. Not just him, but the illusion I had clung to. The grief came in waves. One moment I was furious, the next I was shattered. I missed the man he used to be, or maybe the man I thought he was. I missed the girl I used to be, the one who believed forever meant something. But alongside the grief, something else grew, a hard kernel of strength. Every time I replayed that night at the fundraiser, the gasps, the whispers, the way his face crumbled, I remembered that I wasn't powerless anymore. I had taken back what he'd stolen, my voice. The community saw it too. Mrs. Peterson from across the street came by with a casserole, as though heartbreak could be patched with cheese and noodles. "Julia," she said, her eyes fierce, "you did what most women wouldn't dare. You showed them who he really is." I smiled weakly, but her words lodged inside me, not as praise but as reminder. I had crossed a threshold I could never uncross. At work, the bakery was busier than ever. Customers came not just for bread and pastries, but to look me in the eye, to tell me I was strong, to slip bills into the tip jar with words like "Stay proud" scribbled on napkins. Each gesture was small, but together they built a net that held me up. At night, he still tried to fight. He slammed doors, accused me of ruining his reputation, of destroying everything he'd worked for. I let him rant. His words bounced off me now, hollow and brittle. He was the one exposed, the one unraveling. Lying in bed, I would close my eyes and whisper to myself, "This is not the end. This is the beginning of what's left. And what's left is mine." I didn't know if my children would forgive him, or me, or either of us. I didn't know if the anger would ever fade completely, but I knew one thing with certainty. I would never again sit silently while someone else wrote my story, and that realization, painful and raw as it was, felt like freedom. It's strange, the way life reshapes itself after the collapse. For so long, my days had been built around him, his moods, his meals, his appointments. Now, with the truth laid bare, there was a stillness in the house I hadn't known in years. It was heavy at first, like standing in a room after a storm where everything is damp and broken. But slowly, the stillness became space. I began filling it with small rituals of my own. Morning coffee on the porch, watching the sun stretch across the neighborhood. Evening walks after closing the bakery, the air cooling against my skin, my feet carrying me forward one block at a time. The rhythm of kneading dough, once just labor, now felt like meditation, my hands pressing, folding, shaping, creating something new from pieces. People still stop me in town. "Julia, we're proud of you," they'd say, or, "I can't believe you had the courage." Their words washed over me, not because I dismissed them, but because I understood something they didn't. I hadn't set out to be courageous. I had set out to survive. Courage was just the name people gave it afterward. My husband, no, the man who used to be my husband, drifted further from me each day. The community no longer admired him. They avoided him. Business partners cut ties. Old friends crossed the street to keep from shaking his hand. He had thought he could humiliate me without consequence, but it was his own mask that had slipped. And once it was gone, no one wanted to see the man beneath. The children struggled in their own ways. My daughter cried often, anger and grief tangled together. My son carried his rage like armor, brittle and sharp. I couldn't fix it for them, though every instinct in me wanted to. All I could do was stand steady, show them that survival was possible, even when the foundation of your life cracks open. At night, I sometimes caught myself wondering, had I ruined his life as he claimed? Maybe I had, but if I did, it wasn't because of malice or failure. It was because I refused to keep living blind. I ruined the illusion he built for himself, the illusion of control, of superiority, of secrecy. I ruined the fantasy that I would remain silent forever. One evening, as I locked up the bakery, I saw my reflection in the glass door. 50 years old. Tired, yes. Marked by grief, yes. But not broken. My hair silvering at the edges, my face lined with years of work and worry, but my eyes were steady, alive in a way they hadn't been in decades. I thought back to that night, the toast that shattered the room, the sound of his voice, smug and cruel, the second voice sharp and mysterious, and mine too. At the time, those words had felt like an additional wound. Now I realized they had also been a gift, a reminder that I wasn't alone in carrying scars from him, a reminder that his cruelty stretched further than me, and that my silence only served him. That night had ended my old life, but it also began a new one. So here I am, standing in the aftermath, holding both truths, the loss and the freedom. I mourn the years I gave to a man who never truly saw me, but I celebrate the woman who finally saw herself. On my 50th year, I thought I was being buried under shame. In reality, I was being unearthed. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Survival doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like standing up, steady and scarred, saying, "You don't get to write the ending of my story. I do." So here's my toast to myself, to the woman who endured, who uncovered, who rebuilt, to the woman who, for too long, lived in someone else's shadow, but now stands in her own light. To me,